Your coffee costs more this month. You noticed. Your phone took 3 weeks to ship instead of 3 days. You noticed. But you didn't connect them. Nobody told you these aren't coincidences, they're symptoms. Most people think power shifts look like war, invasions, headlines. They're wrong. The most dangerous shift happening right now is invisible. It looks like your normal Tuesday. If you want to see what everyone's missing, subscribe to this channel, because once you see this, you can't unsee it. And comment below, does America see this coming, or are we already too late? People think this is about trade wars, about tariffs and military budgets. They see politicians arguing, headlines screaming about tensions, debates over semiconductors. But real power doesn't confront. It replaces. And here's what nobody's saying out loud. The US isn't being attacked, it's being quietly bypassed. The strategy is so subtle that by the time you notice, reversing it will cost more than you're willing to pay. Let me show you how this actually works. Over the last 20 years, China didn't expand with tanks, they expanded with contracts. While America spent trillions in Middle East wars, China was signing deals, ports, railways, power grids, digital infrastructure. These aren't just construction projects, they're leverage. When a ship docks at a port, the owner decides who unloads first. That decision shapes entire economies. It determines which goods move, which businesses thrive, which countries get priority. Right now, China owns or controls over 70 ports across 6 continents. 70. Let that sink in. 70 choke points where global trade passes through infrastructure they control. But here's where it gets deeper. There's an initiative most Americans have barely heard of. It's called Belt and Road. Over 150 countries signed agreements. That's 3/4 of the world. And most Americans, they've never heard of it. These aren't aid packages. They're decades-long infrastructure contracts that lock countries into Chinese financial systems, Chinese construction standards, Chinese maintenance requirements. Pakistan needed highways. China built them. Kenya needed railways. China constructed them. Greece's largest port needed modernization. China bought it. Each deal seems reasonable on its own. A country needs infrastructure. China provides it. Simple. But zoom out and you see the pattern. These aren't isolated transactions. They're pieces of a network that slowly shifts where power lives. Now here's what affects you directly. When influence shifts, your everyday life changes. You're already feeling it even if you don't recognize the source. Your smartphone costs more because rare earth minerals for batteries come from Chinese-controlled mining operations. 90% of them. During the pandemic, when hospitals ran out of equipment, you discovered that 80% of active pharmaceutical ingredients in American medicines came from one country, China. When American companies want to do business globally, they increasingly go through Chinese-controlled infrastructure, Chinese payment systems, Chinese digital platforms. And if this continues, America won't collapse. It'll simply matter less. The dollar will exist. The military will stay strong, but the ability to shape outcomes, to set standards, to determine which countries rise and which struggle, that power will have moved. Jeff Bezos once said something that explains this perfectly. Your margin is my opportunity. China applied that logic to the entire world. They didn't chase dominance through confrontation. They built dependency through necessity. They looked at what the world needed, what America wasn't providing or couldn't provide fast enough, and they filled every gap. Need infrastructure built quickly? China does it faster and cheaper than Western firms. Need manufacturing at scale? China has supply chains already established. Need cutting-edge technology? Chinese companies now lead in 5G networks, facial recognition systems, drone technology, electric vehicle batteries. They didn't beat America at its own game. They changed the game entirely. Let me tell you a story that shows exactly how this works. Zambia, 2013. The government needed to upgrade telecommunications. The existing network was outdated, couldn't handle growth. They approached Western companies. The quotes came back. 5 years, $2 billion. Then came a Chinese offer, 18 months, $800 million, plus financing. At first, the deal looked like help. Zambia's president signed. His people celebrated. Finally, modern infrastructure they desperately needed. Citizens could access internet reliably for the first time. Businesses could compete globally. Everyone won. 5 years later, Zambia tried to renegotiate terms. That's when they discovered something. The Chinese company owned the encryption keys. All of them. Every text message in the country, every phone call, every bank transaction, every government communication. The entire nation's digital infrastructure ran through servers Zambian officials couldn't access. A government official said this, off the record, to a Western journalist. We wanted to say no, but saying no meant our whole country would go dark. Our banks would freeze. Our hospitals would lose connection. We had no choice. There were no soldiers, no invasion, no occupation, just a signature. And 5 years later, that signature meant Zambia no longer controlled its own communication system. This pattern repeated across dozens of nations. In Sri Lanka, China financed a massive port. When Sri Lanka couldn't repay loans, China took a 99-year lease on the port and 15,000 acres of land surrounding it. In Djibouti, a tiny African nation, China built a military base right next to America's only permanent base in Africa. They didn't ask permission. They signed a deal with Djibouti's government, which by that point owed China billions. In Malaysia, Chinese companies built entire cities, complete with governance structures that operate semi-independently from Malaysian law. These aren't conspiracies. They're public contracts that most people simply didn't notice. Now bring this back to America. You think we're immune because we're wealthy, because we have our own infrastructure. Partially true. China can't use the same tactics here, but influence doesn't require direct control. It requires leverage. And China's been accumulating leverage in ways most people don't see. They own over $1 trillion in U.S. Treasury bonds. They're major investors in American real estate in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles. Chinese companies have acquired American businesses in strategic sectors, technology firms, agricultural companies, entertainment studios. Each acquisition seems small, but together they create deep interdependence that limits what American policymakers can actually do. Here's what that means for you. When your government considers strong actions against China, whether on trade, technology restrictions, or human rights, they calculate consequences. If China sells treasury bonds, your mortgage interest rate could spike. If Chinese companies pull investments, your city loses jobs. If Chinese manufacturers slow production, store shelves empty. This isn't about military threats, it's economic reality. And China built this reality deliberately, piece by piece, while America was distracted. The technology sector shows another dimension. For years, American companies led global tech development. Silicon Valley set standards. American platforms dominated everything. But look at what's happening now. TikTok, owned by Chinese company ByteDance, has over 150 million American users. That's nearly half the US population. The app collects data on behavior, preferences, consumption patterns. And Chinese law requires companies to share data with government when requested. Think about the implications. China potentially has detailed behavioral profiles on half of America. They know what content resonates with you, what messages spread, what triggers engagement. That's not commercial information. It's strategic intelligence about American psychology. Or consider 5G networks, the infrastructure powering next-generation communication. Huawei, a Chinese company, leads the world in 5G patents and deployment. America banned Huawei from US networks citing security concerns. But here's the problem. Most of the world uses Huawei equipment. When American businesses operate internationally, their communications travel through Chinese-controlled infrastructure. The encryption might be strong, but the network architecture itself is Chinese-designed. That creates vulnerabilities that didn't exist when American companies built global systems. Solar panels tell the same story. China produces over 80% of the world's solar panels. As countries transition to renewable energy to fight climate change, they become dependent on Chinese manufacturing. The US announced massive solar expansion plans. Where will those panels come from? Mostly China. America could build domestic production, but it takes years and costs significantly more. Meanwhile, the climate crisis demands immediate action, so countries buy Chinese panels because they're available now and affordable. Each purchase deepens dependency. The same pattern exists in electric vehicle batteries, pharmaceutical ingredients, consumer electronics, telecommunications equipment, rare earth minerals. China positioned itself as the indispensable supplier for technologies that define 21st century life. They didn't do this accidentally. It was strategic planning executed over decades while America focused elsewhere. Here's the big reveal that changes everything. The US military could defeat China's military. Today, tomorrow, 10 years from now. Analysts agree on this. But that doesn't matter anymore, because China already won where it counts. They're not coming for Washington. They came for Zambia, for Pakistan, for Greece, for Kenya, for 70 countries you've never thought about. And when you lose 70 countries, you don't notice it on Tuesday. You notice it 5 years later when your prices double and nobody can explain why in terms that make sense. This shift didn't start yesterday. It started 20 years ago, when you weren't paying attention, when America was fighting different battles, when China was patient and America was distracted. Traditional power shifts came with clear signals. Military buildups, territory grabbed, obvious threats. Countries could see them and prepare. But economic dependency builds quietly. By the time you realize you're dependent, extracting yourself causes massive disruption. It's like discovering your entire house sits on someone else's foundation. You can't just move. Rebuilding would cost everything. So you stay, accepting terms you'd never have agreed to originally, because the alternative is worse. Now imagine this. Tomorrow morning, your phone doesn't charge properly. It's not broken. It's just that batteries use rare earth minerals and 90% come from one source. They decide to slow production. Not stop. Just slow. Your phone now costs $500 more. You buy it anyway because you need it for work, for life, for everything. Now apply that logic to insulin, to fertilizer, to the circuit boards in your car, to the chips in your laptop. This isn't hypothetical. The infrastructure enabling this is already in place. And when it activates, you won't call it geopolitics. You'll call it inflation. You'll blame your president. You'll blame corporations. You won't see the real source because the real source is buried in supply chains and infrastructure deals signed 15 years ago in countries you can't find on a map. American policymakers are waking up to this. The bipartisan concern about China emerging in recent years reflects this awakening. But recognition comes late. The dependencies are established. Untangling them requires years of painful adjustment. Reshoring manufacturing, building alternative supply chains, developing competitive technologies. These efforts take time and enormous amounts of money. Meanwhile, China continues expanding influence in regions America neglected after the Cold War ended. Africa, Latin America, Central Asia, places where American attention waned and Chinese investment flooded in. The real question facing America isn't whether this shift is happening. The data makes that undeniable. The question is whether America can adapt fast enough. Can a country built on military dominance and dollar supremacy compete in a world where influence flows through infrastructure ownership and supply chain control? Can democratic systems, with 4-year election cycles and competing interests, match the long-term strategic planning of authoritarian states that think in decades? These aren't rhetorical questions. They determine whether America remains a force that shapes global events or becomes shaped by forces it no longer controls. Consider how quickly things changed. In 2008, during the financial crisis, China held American debt, but hadn't expanded globally yet. 17 years later, they built the world's largest navy by ship count, established a global infrastructure network spanning 6 continents, and became the primary trading partner for more countries than America. Another 17 years at this pace, and the global order will look fundamentally unrecognizable. Not because of war, because of accumulated economic influence that makes confrontation unnecessary. Here's what makes this particularly insidious. When China builds a port in a developing nation, it looks like development. When they finance a railway, it looks like aid. When they provide telecommunications infrastructure, it looks like partnership. The intentions only become clear years later when the dependent country tries to make an independent decision and discovers it can't afford to. By then, switching costs are astronomical. Training new technicians, buying different equipment, rebuilding systems. Most countries don't have those resources, so they stay locked in, even when terms become unfavorable. The real danger isn't that China sees this shift clearly. It's that Americans still believe it hasn't begun. Most people see the world through outdated frameworks where military strength and political alliances determine outcomes, but modern power operates differently. It flows through fiber optic cables laid under oceans, through container ships docking at strategically positioned ports, through digital platforms that shape what billions see and think, through supply chains that determine what gets made and where. China understands this deeply. They've been playing this game for 2 decades while America measured power in aircraft carriers and nuclear weapons. Because China's next move won't target governments, it will target you directly. They're already doing it. Chinese platforms are expanding into Western markets. Chinese payment systems are becoming global standards. Chinese brands are replacing American products in markets worldwide. When this reaches critical mass, when average Americans use Chinese platforms for daily transactions, watch Chinese streaming services for entertainment, rely on Chinese technology for communication, the shift completes. Not through conquest, through choice. Because by that point, Chinese options will simply work better, cost less, and integrate more seamlessly than alternatives. You won't choose them for political reasons. You'll choose them because they're superior products built on 2 decades of strategic investment, while American companies focused on quarterly earnings. And when that happens, the shock won't feel geopolitical. It will feel personal. It'll feel like your paycheck buys less, like opportunities disappeared, like choices narrowed without explanation. You won't connect it to ports built in Africa 15 years ago, or infrastructure deals signed in Asia while you were watching different news. You'll just know something fundamental changed, and by the time you ask what happened, the answer will be too complex and too late to reverse. Because power doesn't announce itself, it just is, and one day you wake up and realize it moved while you were sleeping.